Walking without skin. Managing adversity with vulnerability.
Pain is wrong, every inch of my heart like an open wound. I can't go on, I'll drown if I don't stop the bleeding soon.
But an 18 or 19-year-old guy doesn't. So he starts acting like these male porn stars that he sees, and he starts being aggressive and basically acting like a jerk. The addiction is not the main problem. The main problem is what caused the addiction.
Where can I find some protection to prevent this ongoing infection? I'm walking without skin.
You are listening to Walking Without Skin, the show where we encourage our guests to be vulnerable, to share their voices with authenticity, to tell their stories from the heart. We will talk about hope and recovery, about overcoming loss, changes, challenges, and adversities. We will walk without skin.
How will I know when it's safer? When every step feels like sandpaper. I'm walking without skin. I'm walking without skin.
And here is your host, Lois Wagner.
Hi, I am Lois, your friend for forgiveness and the creator of Walking Without Skin. I have a book with the same title, Walking Without Skin. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting to Joshua Shea from Maine in the USA. Hi, Joshua.
Hi, how are you, Lois?
Great, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No, you're welcome. Joshua is a pornography addiction expert, certified betrayal trauma coach, and the author of 3 books about pornography addiction, including one that's called He's a Porn Addict, Now What? An expert and former addict answers your questions. He works full-time as a certified betrayal trauma coach with the Post Betrayal Trauma Institute in New York. So before we get into all of that, I'd like to ask you, what does the term walking without skin mean to you?
I think it means, because it's funny, when you asked me to be on this, I was like, I love the name of that. It means something different to me because even though you can't tell looking at me, I have a lot of tattoos. All of my tattoos came after recovery. I guess I went from addicted to pornography and alcohol to addicted to tattoos. And my skin is now a very important part of me because it tells the story of my life. Because every tattoo I get is an important part of that. So the idea of walking without skin, it almost reminds me of who I was prior to recovery, because now I feel like I've got this like suit of armor, which includes my tattoos that are on my skin. And before, it felt like I in a way, I was walking without skin because I didn't have my story. I wasn't my genuine self. I wasn't the healthiest, best version of myself I could be. And when I saw the name of your show, that's what actually came to mind, was the fact that, and maybe I'm totally off what you were going for, but walking without skin kind of meant to me that I was walking in a non-genuine, non-authentic way. And I'm now walking with skin, and my skin literally has my scars and the story of me on it.
So do you have stories of pornography in your tattoos?
I have stories of recovery, but I don't have anything that would be considered pornographic.
Okay. So before we go any further, can you explain to me what a post-betrayal trauma consultant or coach is?
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, when I got into this, the first thing that I did was I coached a lot of pornography addicts themselves. And what I started to get messages about was from partners of porn addicts and partners of sex addicts, 90% female, who were, I've read your books, I've seen your website. You are a success story. You are what I want my husband or I want my boyfriend to experience. I want him to get as healthy as you did. But more than that, I feel bad. I feel like I'm not pretty enough. I'm not enough in bed. What is it that I did to make him become a porn addict? And the reality is, it's nothing. You didn't make him be a porn addict. You didn't make him cheat. But those feelings you have, and they can range from absolute despair to just kind of being, peeved at him. That feeling is what's known as betrayal trauma. And for a certain amount of people who go through this, it is a massive, massive trauma where they start to look at their partner and wonder, has anything been true? If this guy can lie about having sex with other women outside of our marriage, if he can lie that, he's been looking at porn for 10 years, what else don't I know about this guy? And it really rocks their worlds. And what I do is I help them get through that entire process. And what's unique about me is, number one, I'm a guy, and only about 5% of coaches out there right now are guys. And number two, I'm actually someone who has been through the problem. It's almost like speaking a language or riding a bike. I know how to speak addict. So I can actually help translate a lot of what their husbands or boyfriends are trying to say to them, but they either don't believe or they're not sure is true. And I can help them get through that really rough trauma that comes when you find out that your partner's been lying to you for so long.
I would like to try and link that to gender-based, not necessarily violence, but gender-based abuse, because that betrayal is a form of abuse.
Absolutely. And I think that while the phrase betrayal trauma is starting to become popular right now, I think it's just a 2021 way of saying trauma from the last person I thought would ever traumatize me. You trust your partner, you trust this person you've married or you're in a long-term relationship in. This is supposed to be the most important relationship in your life. And all of a sudden, everything is different. And that's the thing. If you haven't been betrayed, you don't really understand it. Imagine, you and I both know the sky is blue. And imagine that one day I tell you, guess what, Lois, the sky is yellow. And you're like, oh, no way, forget about that. That can't be true. And it's like, no, the sky is actually yellow. You know the sky is blue. The sky's always been blue since you were a little girl. And then you walk outside and see the sky is actually yellow. And I tell you, guess what? We've been playing a trick on you. The sky is yellow. It's never been blue. That would rock your world, because everything you trust about the sky starts and ends with the fact that it's blue. And now it's yellow. And even though it may not be a massive, massive change in the world, it's a massive, massive change in your world. And everything everything you trust is absolutely rocked. And what you see is that because of the way pornography especially was handled in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, before we had the internet, it was specifically marketed towards a straight white male audience. And with it being marketed that way, you got a lot of themes of violence, of male dominance that I think carried with a lot of those men for a long time. And more importantly, this has nothing to do with addiction, but I'll tell you a quick story. The last time I was able to be at a college giving a proper presentation was right before all the COVID stuff started. And I spoke at a health center to a women's sexuality group. I spoke for 30 minutes, did my routine, then went to the Q&A. And one of the women, she was probably 19 or 20, raised her hand and said, have you talked to many girls my age who don't want to have sex with virgin men? And I was like, what are you talking about? And she said, well, if you think about it, you just told us that the average boy sees pornography for the first time at about 10 years old, and he starts watching regularly at 12 or 13. Now, if you look at college or university, depending on what you call it, wherever you are in the world, a lot of the guys who go there are guys who are still virgins and for whatever reason, and they end up finally meeting a girl who's willing to give it up to them. But between 12 and 18, between 12 and 19, if these guys have been regular porn watchers, not addicts, but just regular porn watchers, they have seen hundreds, if not thousands, of pornographic scenes by the time they have their first actual sexual encounter in real life. And as this young woman pointed out to me, she said what's happening is that even in the most vanilla pornography, even in the most standard one man, one woman, nothing extreme, nothing exotic as far as pornography goes, you are still going to see the man be the aggressor. You're still going to see the man put his hand probably around the woman's throat. You're still going to see the man speak horribly to her and bend her like a pretzel, and she doesn't do any of that to him. And that doesn't even talk about the fact that almost every one of these videos ends in a horribly demeaning manner with not traditional sex, but with a graphic act, usually on a woman's face. And that's not real sex. But if you're an 18-year-old guy, you don't know that. Those of us who have been in healthy, normal sexual relationships knows that three-ways aren't a normal thing. We know that this exotic sex hanging from the ceiling and all of these acts that you think people do in real life, they don't do. And so these young women, they started to nod their heads. So I got in an interesting conversation with them, and they talked about how if they bring a virgin guy, 18, 19, back to their room, this guy, most of the time, will act like a porn star because that's where he's learned. Porn is our sex ed for these days. And if they haven't been in a healthy, normal sexual relationship, how are they going to know that pornography is fake? How are they going to know that? You and I know pornography is not a documentary. Pornography is not a reality show. Pornography is complete fiction. And those of us who have, like I said, have had normal, healthy sexual relationships know this. But an 18 or 19-year-old guy doesn't. So he starts acting like these male porn stars that he sees, and he starts being aggressive and basically acting like a jerk. And these young women don't want it anymore. They've all had to deal with it so many times. And I've heard this from many other women since who are in that age group, that young guys who don't have sex experience are trying to act like porn stars. And that speaks nothing of addiction. It just speaks about how online pornography being streamed to young people's phones, young people's tablets, young people's laptops, it is changing their mindsets about sex. It's changing their mindsets about intercourse. And even though this population may not be addicted, they are certainly being affected by pornography, by the messages that come out with it. And thankfully, we're at a place in the world where young women feel empowered and strong enough to go, no, you don't act like that. Because that isn't always the way that it's been in this world. And hopefully these young men will get this message. Hopefully once these young women start having kids and they can teach them to be strong young people or to stay away from pornography and at least teach them that it's fake. That's what's happening in today's society. And like I said, that's nothing to do with addiction. It just has to do with the attitudes, especially the gender attitudes that pornography is putting out there in today's world.
There's so many questions I want to ask coming out of that. But the first one is, what is the difference between somebody who's addicted and somebody who just watches porn?
As far as the brain chemistry of addiction goes, across all addiction, it's about 95% the same. I always tell people, sex addiction doesn't take place between your legs. Food addiction doesn't take place in your stomach. Cocaine addiction doesn't take place in your nose. All addiction takes place in your mind. When you're an addict, you are engaging in an activity that you understand will probably have negative repercussions, but something about you cannot stop anyway. And that can be extended to making deals with yourself to not engage, but you can't stop. Prioritizing your addiction over everything else, including work, including family, changing your lifestyle, treating the addiction as what you plan your day around. It's the most important thing in your life. That's what happens with any addiction across the board. Now, when you look at the specific chemicals, the dopamine, the oxytocin, the serotonin, there's 6 or 7 of them. The formula that is created in your head with pornography is most similar to cocaine addiction. So for people who, don't understand the lore of pornography, it is very similar to the lore of cocaine. And that's what it really is about. It's not about sitting down in front of a computer or sitting down in front of your phone and just looking at pictures of people and pleasuring yourself and using it as a sexual release and then walking away from it, and it's completely normal. It's like there are people who can have 2 beers and then they walk away. There are people who can go to a casino, bet a few dollars, then walk away. That's the same thing with pornography. You can be a pornography user and not be an addict. For me, pornography was not about what was on the screen. It wasn't about the masturbation. It wasn't about technically anything I was looking at. It was that what I was looking at calm the storm in my head. And when it comes to males, there was a study done in the United States back in the late 90s, right when the internet was starting, by Dr. Patrick Carnes, who's kind of the godfather of sex and porn addiction studies. And what he found was that over 70% of American men who were porn or sex addicts had some kind of unresolved trauma based on physical abuse. 80% had some kind of trauma based on sexual abuse, and over 90% had some kind of trauma based on emotional or mental abuse. So if you look at those numbers, most men, American men who are either sex or porn addicts, they have one or more types of trauma in their background that's unresolved. In my case, my porn addiction grew out of the fact that I was sexually abused as a kid, and I was also mentally and emotionally abused. Thankfully, there was no physical abuse, but I do have those other two. And when I discovered pornography at 12 years old back in 1987, it was different. It was like a warm feeling came over me the first time I saw hardcore pornography. It was immediate. I knew that this was something that was going to help me the rest of my life. This wasn't like, oh, I had a good food for the first time, or, ooh, I found a video game I liked. This created a very visceral change in me the moment I saw it. So I didn't develop a porn addiction over many, many years. My porn addiction probably took 30 seconds to develop. And that's the same thing. The only other time I ever felt this warm feeling come over me and this, aha, I have found a secret to life, was about 2 years later when I was at a wedding and I got very drunk for the first time. I all of a sudden was like, hey, this feels great. I'm a better dancer. I'm funnier. Everything about me is better with this alcohol. And from that point forward, from 14 years old straight through to 37, when I got into recovery about 7-8 years ago, almost every day I drank or I used pornography, sometimes great amounts, whether I was in school or starting my career, whether I was dating or I had no girlfriend or I was even married, whether I had my kids or not, didn't matter where I was in life between 14 years old and 37 years old. More than anything else, I knew that pornography and to a lesser extent alcohol would always be there for me, always make me feel better. I learned later on in my recovery that it was a lot about control issues that I had. But those were the two things I could count on. And that's not how I feel about things like video games or gambling or things that I'm not addicted to. They're just things that are out there. And for the average porn user, it's something that's out there. You can utilize it to assist in your sexual gratification, assuming you don't have any moral issues with it. And as I tell people, I am not necessarily anti-pornography. I have strong personal feelings about it, but that's not what my message is about. My message is more about being pro-healthy sexuality. And that's why I'm out there trying to educate people about pornography and pornography addiction. Because if we won't talk about this, we're not going to tackle the problems in today's society with porn addiction. And the numbers are scary. Before the pandemic, which forced us all to sit at home in front of our computers, men under 30 years old, one study showed that 32% said that they had a problem with pornography, were developing an addiction, or had an addiction. That's 1 out of 3. This was America. That's 1 out of 3 American men under 30 said they have an unhealthy relationship with pornography. So if we don't start talking about this stuff, and it's the same across the world, if you look at statistics, especially Western Europe and India, you see that this is an international problem and that we need to start talking about it, because we didn't know what would happen with the internet and certain things. The internet put a lot of businesses out of business, but it also helped a lot of businesses, and the pornography industry was absolutely helped by the internet. And it's a different world in 2021 than it was in 1985. And we give every child the greatest porn computer ever created when we hand them their smartphone, and we're not teaching them how to use it correctly. We're not teaching them what pornography is. And parents have to accept that even if they want to believe filters do anything, which they don't, it's not a matter of if your child is going to see pornography in today's world. It's a matter of when and how are they going to react. If you don't know how your kid's going to react when somebody on the school bus holds up their phone and shows them, some pornography, you haven't porn-proofed your kids. You haven't prepared your kids for it. It's too bad that you have to. But in today's world, if you want to stack the deck in your favor, you have to talk to your kids about pornography and pornography addiction to be aware of it.
Have you come across any women who are addicted to porn?
Absolutely. I would say right now that 10% of my pornography addiction clients are women, and women are actually one of the fastest growing segments of the pornography addiction community. And I think that's because of the ease of use of getting it and of the fact that pornography is now targeted towards women. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, in the 70s and 80s, pornography targeted straight white men. And that is because it cost a lot to make a movie. It cost a lot to distribute a movie. If you wanted to see a porn movie in 1978 or 1983, you had to go to a theater to see it. And it cost a lot of money for the people in Hollywood to make that movie and get it there. Now, if you and I start early enough in the day, we can, even being on 2 different continents, we can create a porn movie that is making money for us by the end of the day. It doesn't cost much to make porn these days. It costs almost nothing to produce it and to distribute it. And because it's so cheap to make, it's so much easier to turn a profit. Because you got to remember, at the core, this is a business. And with it being so much easier to turn a profit these days, you can, as a porn producer, target your audience. So before, where you wouldn't target women, you can today, because you can get enough women to watch. And unlike before, where a woman wouldn't go into a theater like that, or a woman wouldn't go to a adult bookstore or a head shop or something like that to purchase pornography or purchase a sex toy. Well, nowadays, they don't have to leave the house. They've got their computer in front of them. They got their phone in front of them. And, oh, gee, what do you know? Women are just as sexual as men. And they enjoy porn just as much as men. It's just that they didn't have access to it, and it was not targeted to them. Now that the content is targeted to them, you see far more porn addicts that are women. It's the same thing with black men. Black men, after white women, are the second biggest group that is seeing numbers go up in pornography addiction. And then right after that, you've got members of the Mormon church and members of the Catholic church. Again, the kind of people who would never have been caught dead 20 years ago walking into an adult theater for fear that somebody might see them. But now that they're at home, nobody can see them do this stuff. So they're utilizing it. So you're now seeing pornography addiction across every demographic. There is no such thing as a stereotypical porn user anymore. I have met men and women from 16 into their late 70s, every demographic you can imagine. People from everywhere in the world, every color, every religion, smart, stupid, rich, poor, it doesn't matter. People need to recognize there is no stereotypical porn addict, and that includes women, because there are plenty of women who are, and unfortunately, they're suffering even more silently than the men these days, because there's just not much of a community of women to get together who have this issue to talk to each other. One of these women walks into a 12-step group like Sexaholics Anonymous or Sex Addicts Anonymous, they're probably going to walk into a room that's 90% men, and that's not comfortable for them. So unfortunately, there are not a lot of resources for the female pornography addict, but they are absolutely out there.
Now, let's talk about your recovery. How did you get into recovery?
Ultimately, I started to spiral. I was an owner of a publishing company. We created 3 magazines. It was a very popular publishing company from 2008 to 2012. In 2013, we saw a big hit on our revenue as far as selling advertising goes. And I still don't know what it was about, but it challenged me as a business person. And I was diagnosed in my early 20s as having bipolar disorder. I made the absolutely horrible, stupid mistake of pulling myself off of my bipolar meds in early 2013. And I think I romanticized the mania from when I was young. I thought that if I pulled myself off of my pills, I would be able to access a level of creativity I hadn't been able to. I would be able to have an energy and a manic energy that would help me solve some of the problems of money at my company. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Once the medicine wore off, my alcohol and my porn use probably tripled or quadrupled. So instead of making the situation better, I made it worse. I started drinking at work. I started looking at pornography all times of the day. And I did this for nearly a year, and it got worse. I was a guy who drank beer. By the end of 2013, I was drinking half a bottle of tequila every day. I was somebody who looked at porn for maybe 30 minutes to an hour a day prior. I was now looking 3 or 4 hours a day, and I was going into chat rooms and talking to women for the first time. I'd never done that. But like any addiction, pornography escalates. The way you need to drink more or the way you need to use more drugs to feel the same, pornography is the same thing. It escalates. Basically, finally, the 3 other owners of my company tried to have an intervention with me, and I kind of laughed at them, and they ended up firing me from my job. And my wife had a couple of confrontations with me about my health. My parents had a couple of confrontations with me about my health. And finally, there was basically an intervention of some people. And I knew that I was very sick, but I knew that I was going to lose everything if I didn't get my act together. So on April 1st, 2014, I checked myself into a rehab out in California, which is 3,000 miles away from where I live. And I spent the next 10 weeks there getting myself straight from alcohol. And what was interesting was that I never knew that porn addiction was a separate addiction. I thought my porn addiction was just about bad decisions I made when I was drunk. And one of the mental health professionals who I spoke with while I was in out in California, he explained to me that porn addiction was a separate addiction. And when we started to examine it, that I also had porn addiction, that it was probably a bigger problem than my alcohol addiction, and that it actually had been there much longer than my alcohol addiction. And while I absolutely needed to get my drinking under control, when I was done with that rehab, a little time later, I actually went to an inpatient rehab for sex and porn addiction. Despite the fact I hadn't looked for nearly a year when I went there, I needed to go there because they were supposedly one of the better trauma centers when it came to addiction. And that's where I started to do the very deep work of learning why I became an addict, because that's the most important thing that you have to recognize about addiction. The addiction is not the main problem. The main problem is what caused the addiction. Why did you adopt these very dangerous coping habits along the way? What caused you to choose to do this thing that you know is bad for you, that it's bad for your life? What was it that caused that? For me, it was all that trauma. It was trying to escape that trauma. That's what it is for most addicts. And until, you need to look at addiction as a symptom of a bigger problem. It's not the problem itself. It's like if you get, a rash isn't necessarily the core problem you have. It's a symptom of the core problem. And that's what most people who are successful in recovery, it's not just a matter of dealing with the triggers of the addiction. It's a matter of going back and figuring out how you became an addict in the first place. And when I do my coaching, it's about 25% about your triggers and learning not to use. And then 75% of it is going back and figuring out, why did you need this stuff in the first place? Because trauma repeats itself again and again. And with the women I deal with who are dealing with betrayal trauma, it's never the first trauma they've had. That betrayal trauma wakes up other traumas. If you're an addict and you go through some kind of trauma, it wakes up your old traumas. And that's when it's time to get help. That's when it's time to work on it, because you've woken something up inside yourself that you can get in and really do the work on some of that stuff that you've frankly been trying to forget for years.
But what piece of advice can you give somebody who is an addict and who wants to take that first step? How would you coach them or advise them?
I would say to find somebody who has had the same addiction and has been successful in recovery. I'm not saying to make them your best friend or make them an accountability partner or sponsor, but just have a conversation with somebody who's been where you've been and has succeeded in getting better. That is going to show you that it's real, that it's possible. Find somebody who's been through it, who you can talk to. One of the most amazing things in my work is when I have a male client for the first time who is a porn addict, and he starts to talk to me and he realizes I don't care what he looked at. I probably saw worse along the way. I'm not going to shame him for what he looked at. I'm not going to embarrass him. I'm not going to make him feel bad about himself or herself. And once this person recognizes that for the first time, they're in a very safe space to talk about their pornography, you almost see a change in their body. Like, finally, I can talk to somebody about this who isn't going to look at me like I'm a pervert or like there's something wrong with me, because I understand this doesn't really have to do with sex. This doesn't really have to do with getting off. This has to do with curing the storm in your head. It could have been food. It could have been gambling. It could have been heroin. For whatever reason, it's porn. And that doesn't make you a bad person. That doesn't make you evil. That doesn't make you immoral. It makes you sick. Addiction is a brain disease. And unfortunately, you can reverse it, but seeing those men just have that moment of, oh my God, thank God I found somebody I can talk to about this, who is not going to make me feel bad about myself. To me, that's the first step, that you have to find somebody like that. Of course, you need therapy or counseling or coaching. Research is always good. It's an intense process for recovery. But the very first thing I would do is find somebody who's been through it, just so you can have a conversation, find out how they do it, and find out, what's best for you. Is it best to go to a 12-step group? Is it best to go see a coach or a therapist? Are you going to be better off if you're just online because you're so shy? You can go to online forums and online support groups and participate there. There are many different modalities if you want them. And most people who have been successful with recovery from any addiction usually mix and match a lot of the modalities. I've never seen anybody just do therapy or anybody just do 12 steps. Usually it's a mix of different techniques that works for them, and what works for them may not work for everybody, because recovery is a very individualistic kind of thing.
Most definitely. And do you do any work with those 12, 14, 16-year-olds who aren't yet addicted? Do you work with them to advise or support them?
I don't. What I try to do is get to their parents. I don't necessarily feel comfortable talking to people that age. That people that age don't want to hear what I'm going to say. Even if they are watching porn 23 and a half hours of the day, and that 30 minutes I just happen to catch them, they're going to deny they look at porn. So when it comes to teenagers, especially teenage boys, the best thing to do is, if you're a parent, tell them what you need them to hear. One of the reasons that I came out and I started to do all this stuff is because I wondered, is there anything my parents could have told me? Is there anything society could have told me or teachers could have told me? I heard all the anti-drug stuff and I never used drugs. I heard all the anti-smoking stuff. Except for a short period of time, I was never a smoker. And I wonder, is there anything that I could have been told that would have made me not be a porn addict? I'll never know that answer, but maybe there's something that I can put out there that will help people not become porn addicts. And I think a lot of that, and I think a lot of our porn addiction problem in this world is going to fall on the shoulders of parents. They need to start to talk to their kids about it. And what I find when I talk to parents is that they confuse the "don't look at pornography when you're young" speech with the birds and the bees speech. And it's not like that at all. The "don't look at pornography" speech is similar to "don't drink when you're in my house. Don't smoke cigarettes when you're in my house." When you're 18 years old, you can make any decision you want as an adult, but this stuff is not safe for kids, and I don't want you to use it. That's what that discussion is. It's not about how babies are made or how people relate in the bedroom. It's that there is a substance out there that can be harmful for you. So I don't want you to use it. And I think you can start talking to kids when they're very young. You can tell a 7-year-old kid, if you are looking at a phone or a computer and you see pictures of naked people, let mommy or daddy know. I just want to make sure that nothing is, you're not seeing anything that you shouldn't. And just be careful, because I want to take care of you. You don't have to say the word pornography. You just have to slowly introduce concepts. And hopefully by the time they're 12 or 13 years old, they will know that it's probably more healthy for them to not go online and look at that kind of stuff.
If you had a billboard on the side of the street, what would you put on the billboard?
Give me money. No, I probably would. That's a good question. I would probably just put the words "porn, be careful," because I'm not going to be able to, hey, what a pretty kitty. I am not going to be able to. I actually have 7 cats, I'll have you know, and I'm fostering 2 right now. So we have 9 cats in my house currently. So I love cats. I would say I would just put "porn, be careful," because I think for a lot of people, they still don't think pornography can be dangerous. And for most of them, it never will be. However, I think that it would wake enough people up to the idea that, hey, porn can be dangerous, or why do I have to be careful about porn? So it plants a seed, and that's about it. And when it comes to somebody else's porn addiction, you can try to help them, you can nudge them towards rehab or therapy, but like everything else in life, it's up to the individual person. So you just try to plant some seeds and hope they take root, and hope that if they have a problem, they get the help that they need.
I've got a program turning it into a movement. The objective is to eradicate bullying, harassment, sexual violence, and I've called it BRAVE. In that context, what does the word brave mean to you?
To me, the word brave means making the right decision morally, ethically, and for the long-term future, despite the fact that in the short term, you may have more pleasure. You may have a short-term monetary gain. You may experience an abundance of good things or wealth, or you're feeding your baser instincts and just creating pleasure. To me, brave is looking in the face of a short-term gain and going with a longer term gain, even though it may be more painful in the short term. It's the ability to see the big picture and make the best decisions for the long term, not just giving in to the here and now.
It's a very unusual definition, and I must say I really like it. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Tell me, Joshua, how do people get hold of you? I'm assuming you do also coach online?
I only coach online because I live in a very rural area that the people who live around me, they could be porn fiends and they would never admit it. So I have to find the people out there who want some help. Yes, you can go to my website to learn about my coaching. You can also go to my website to learn about my books. There's a list of resources there. And that web address is the letter P and then the words Addict Recovery. So it's P as in Peter, addictrecovery.com. If you wanted to find me on Instagram or on Twitter, same thing, P Addict Recovery. I don't have Facebook because I don't care how you voted in the last election. And I have my website, paddictrecovery.com. You can contact me through there, whether you want coaching or if you just have a question. You know, I'm not going to charge you to answer a question. Come find me. If you can't find something specific you need as far as resources on the website, let me know and I'll help you out. And there's a link if you want to try coaching. And for all those people who are just a little bit nervous, just unsure, I make the first session absolutely free because I want people to realize that coaching is little more than the conversation you and I are having right now. It's just that we live usually around a homogenous group of people. We tend to surround ourselves with people who think a lot like we do. You know, because it's safe, it's insular, it's security. But sometimes we need to talk to people outside. And I think the idea of therapy, counseling, coaching is great because you have somebody who is not part of your regular life, yet they come into it for an hour or two every week, and they become, you know, a real cheerleader trying to help you navigate some of your issues. And then we walk away for a week. And I still think about my clients when I'm not talking to them, but I'm not an active part of their lives. And I think that's a good thing for all of us to have, is somebody who we can share all our secrets with, somebody we can tell anything to, somebody who will talk back to us and challenge us in some of our beliefs, but all in the service of good mental health. I've been going to therapy for 20 years. Even when I was an addict, I was going to therapy. I think that it's something that will greatly enhance anybody's life if they just give it a chance. That's why I do that first free session. I don't want people to feel like they've wasted money if we don't click. That's one thing. You know, if they just have a couple of questions, and they don't need to, spend big money on it, but it lets you try the coaching, the counseling experience, and see that it's just two people talking. It's just a perspective you don't get in your normal life.
Thank you for that, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure our listeners are going to really enjoy this conversation. And the same as you, I invite everybody to go to my website, walkingwithoutskin.com, and I too offer you a free coaching session. And the objective of my coaching session is to get you to fly free.
Oh, I need some props. I need some props. You can take my porn, you can take my alcohol, but you can't take my caffeine. Yes.
You can't take my butterfly.
I like that.
So thank you very, very much, Joshua. And I wish all those listeners who have that problem to seek you out and to fly free.
Thank you so much for letting me talk to your listeners today, Lois. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walking Without Skin. We would love your feedback, opinions, suggestions, and ratings. Please share this podcast far and wide to encourage more people to share their stories with vulnerability and authenticity.